We live in a parenthesis, a brief, fragile pause between the commas of cosmic violence that define the true history of the Earth. Look around you right now. Take a breath. If you are watching this, you are experiencing something that statistically should not exist. Stability. We wake up, we go to work, we complain about the weather or the price of eggs, and we assume, with an almost religious certainty, that tomorrow will be exactly like today. We build cities of glass and steel on the edge of tectonic plates. We lay fiber optic cables across the ocean floor, and we invest in 30-year mortgages as if the ground beneath our feet is a permanent stage that never stops for a scene change. This is the great sedative of the modern world. We have been lulled into a deep sleep by the mythology of a stable planet. But if you peel back the layers of our official story, you realize that this piece isn't the rule. It's the exception. Over the last 200 years, mainstream science, specifically geology, has been governed by a concept called uniformitarianism. It was championed by a man named Charles Lyell in the 1830s. Lyell's big idea was simple. The present is the key to the past. He argued that the Earth was shaped exclusively by the slow grinding forces we see today, the inch-by-inch drift of continents, the quiet erosion of a riverbed over 1 million years. It's an elegant, clean story. It tells us that for 2,000 centuries, humanity took a slow, gradual, uninterrupted stroll from the cave to the stars. No jumps, no glitches, no resets.
It's the ultimate bedtime story. Everything is fine, the ground is solid, and the planet definitely doesn't have a surprise button hidden under the crust.
But every once in a while we find something in the archive of the Earth that doesn't just not fit the straight line, it shatters it. The year was 1901. A team of explorers was trekking through the brutal, windswept barrens of the Berezovka River in Siberia. They weren't looking for a mystery. They were looking for ivory. What they found instead was a geological riddle that still haunts the textbooks. The Berezovka mammoth. This wasn't a skeleton. It wasn't a fossil. It was a 10-ton beast, perfectly preserved in the permafrost, standing in a half-kneeling position. When the explorers began to thaw the carcass, they were hit with a smell that shouldn't have existed, the scent of fresh meat. The mammoth was so well preserved that the sled dogs reportedly began eating the flesh. But it was what they found inside the mammoth's mouth and stomach that changed everything. Under the beast's tongue and between its teeth, they found undigested temperate plants, specifically green buttercups, wild beans, and grasses. These weren't Ice Age plants. They were the plants of a warm, sunny Siberian summer afternoon. For those delicate flowers to remain green and undigested, the temperature had to drop from a temperate 60 degrees Fahrenheit to 150 degrees below zero in a matter of minutes. Think about the physics of that. A 10-ton animal, warm-blooded and massive, was frozen so fast that the very food in its mouth didn't have time to wilt. It's called a flash freeze. It's as if the planet suffered a sudden, violent cardiac arrest, stopping a vibrant ecosystem in its tracks and locking it in an icy vault for 12,000 years.
A 10-ton elephant eating a snack and then, poof, he's a popsicle. Unless that mammoth was standing in a liquid nitrogen spill, the math just doesn't add up.
The gradualist story says this was just an unfortunate event. They tell us the mammoth perhaps fell into a crevasse or was caught in a particularly bad blizzard. But one mammoth is an accident. Hundreds of them found across the Arctic Circle in the same state of instant preservation is a pattern. In the 1950s, a quiet history professor named Charles Hapgood looked at these frozen giants and realized that the official story was a diversion. He didn't think the weather changed, and he thought the ground moved. Supported by a glowing foreword from none other than Albert Einstein, Hapgood proposed a beautiful, radical, and terrifying idea: cataclysmic crustal displacement. Hapgood's theory was simple. The Earth's crust is like the skin of a loose-fitting orange, floating on a layer of liquid rock called the mantle. Usually the weight of the ice caps and the rotation of the planet keep that skin locked in place. But every once in a while, the balance shifts. The lock breaks, and the entire shell of the Earth, continents, oceans, and mountains, slips in a sudden violent movement. Imagine walking into your dining room, grabbing the edge of the tablecloth, and pulling. If you're fast enough, the plates stay. But the food? The food goes everywhere. Hapgood's math suggested that the land moved thousands of miles in a single day. The North Pole became the equator, and while the land shifted, the oceans, possessing their own massive, liquid momentum, tried to stay put. This created a 2-mile-high wall of water that swept across the continents at the speed of sound, a supersonic erasure of everything we had built. It explains the vertical water erosion on the Sphinx. It explains why we find seashells on the peaks of the Andes. And it brings us to a man named Chan Thomas, who looked at this orange skin theory and claimed to have found the one thing Hapgood missed. He found the timer. If you write a book about the end of the world, normally, nobody cares. History is littered with doomsday prophets standing on street corners, shouting into the wind about the coming fire. We usually ignore them. We walk past, clutching our coffees and our certainties, and we assume they're just another glitch in the social fabric. But in 1963, something strange happened to a specific volume titled The Adam and Eve Story by a man named Chan Thomas. It wasn't a religious text, and it wasn't a thriller. It was a dense 237-page engineering analysis of the Earth's past and its inevitable future. And almost as soon as the ink was dry on the first printing, the book didn't just fail, it vanished. It wasn't just forgotten by the public, it was aggressively retrieved from the shelves. The newly formed Central Intelligence Agency didn't just ignore Chan Thomas, they classified him. They pulled the book from the record and locked it away under Security Protocol RDP 79B00752. For 50 years, the full text of Thomas's work sat in a high-security vault, hidden from the public eye. It wasn't until 2013 that the agency finally released a declassified version of the file. But what they gave us wasn't a book, it was a skeleton. If the CIA treats your book like a nuclear secret, you're either a spy or you found something they didn't want the neighbors to see. And based on the Sharpie work, they really didn't want us seeing it. What the public received in 2013 was a 57-page remnant. Out of the original 237 pages, nearly 200 had been sanitized, a clinical intelligence term for tossed into a shredder. Why would the most powerful intelligence agency on the planet care so much about a theory on cataclysmic geology? To find that answer, we have to look at the man behind the pen. Chan Thomas wasn't a mystic or a cult leader. He was a project engineer for McDonnell Douglas. He specialized in gyroscopic systems, the very technology used to keep missiles, satellites, and the early space program on track. When a man who spends his day building stabilizers for the military looks at the Earth and sees it as a wobbly machine, the people in high places tend to listen. Thomas's engineering analysis suggested that the Earth's magnetic field acts as a magnetic lock for the crust. He argued that when that field weakens, something we know happens periodically. The lubricant layer between the inner core and the crust liquefies. The lock breaks, the crust slips, and in less than a day, the geography of the entire planet rotates 90 degrees. Hapgood had proposed the concept, but Chan Thomas was the one who worked for them. He was the one who reportedly figured out the trigger. He identified that the sun itself causes this catastrophic shift through periodic high-intensity solar micronovas. They couldn't debunk his math, so they took the book. 57 pages of what happened and 200 pages of, here's the math we aren't telling you. It's like being given the instructions for a shelf but finding the how to not die section missing. Maybe they were just being cautious. Or maybe, as the theory of panic management suggests, they realized that a global workforce that knows the building is scheduled for demolition isn't going to be very productive. They left us the poetry of Adam and Eve and hid the physics of the shutdown. But even in those 57 pages, the breadcrumbs are there. Thomas points to a recurring heartbeat of destruction, a 12,000-year cycle that doesn't just change the climate, but erases the slate. It's a countdown that has happened before, And according to the Archive, it's a countdown that is currently ticking. The Archive didn't want the truth. They wanted silence. But silence is a hard thing to maintain when the Earth itself refuses to stop screaming. To understand why Chan Thomas was silenced, we have to leave the vaults of the CIA and step out into the mud. We have to look at the misfit evidence, the geological anomalies that simply cannot exist if our official story of slow, gradual change is true. We are told the Great Sphinx was built by the pharaoh Khafre around 2500 BCE. But in the 1990s, a geologist named Robert Schoch noticed something the archaeologists had missed. The erosion on the base of the Sphinx isn't horizontal, which is what you get from thousands of years of desert wind and sand. It's vertical. Vertical fissures on a stone monument are the unique signature of one thing: torrential, sustained, heavy rainfall. The kind of rain that hasn't fallen on the Giza Plateau for over 10,000 years. The Sphinx isn't just a statue, it's a survivor of a global deluge. It was standing there, watching when the parenthesis of peace last snapped. So the Sphinx isn't a desert monument. It's an ancient survivor of a car wash that lasted for 1,000 years. Maybe the pharaohs didn't build it. They just found it and put their name on the lease. This brings us to the most haunting piece of evidence in the entire archive: the black mat. If you dig down into the soil in North America, Europe, or even parts of Asia, you will find a thin, dark layer of carbon. It's only an inch thick, but it marks a boundary. Below it, the world was filled with giant sloths, saber-toothed tigers, and mammoths. Above it, silence. Within that black mat, scientists have found nanodiamonds and iridium, the chemical residue of a massive atmospheric explosion. It marks the exact moment 12,800 years ago, when the temperature of the Earth fell off a cliff and the update began. Mainstream science calls it the Younger Dryas. Chan Thomas called it the reset. We see it in the eye of the Sahara, where massive ripple marks in the sand show that an inland sea was dragged across the continent at 500 miles per hour. We see it in the ancient Sumerian records of the Atrahasis, where the gods decided to wipe the slate because the noise of humanity was too much to bear. The evidence suggests that the Earth isn't a slow-moving river. It's a gyroscopic machine with a loose skin, and every 12,000 years, the gear slips. The mammoths freeze, the Sphinx drowns, and the black mat settles over our ruins. It wasn't a transition, it was a shutdown. They didn't have time to adapt because the pause just snapped. A planetary reboot. And here we are, 12,000 years later, still running on the old version save data, hoping the system doesn't crash before we finish our coffee. The scars are there. They've been sanitized, redacted, and explained away, but they remain. History is not a line, it is a circle. Most of us are taught to view human progress as an infinite upward climb, a ladder where each generation stands on the shoulders of the last. But the archive of our planet's strata tells a different story. It suggests that time isn't a ladder at all, it's a pendulum. And the data suggests that every 12,000 years, the pendulum swings with enough force to liquefy the very foundations of our world. When Chan Thomas looked at the geological record, he didn't see random chaos. He saw a rhythm. He noticed that the Younger Dryas cataclysm wasn't a freak accident. It was the latest tick of a planetary clock that seems to reset civilization every 120 centuries. We see the fingerprints of this 12,000-year cycle everywhere we are allowed to look. We see it in the GSP-2 ice cores from Greenland, which show a violent spike in temperature followed by a 1,000-year freeze. We see it in the sudden, inexplicable abandonment of advanced Neolithic settlements. And most hauntingly, we see it in our own sun. Mainstream science treats the sun as a stable, unchanging nuclear furnace. But the theory of catastrophism suggests our star is actually a variable star, one that experiences periodic, massive outbursts called solar micronovas. Every 12,000 years, the sun's magnetic field reaches a tipping point, releasing a shell of superheated plasma into the solar system. So the sun isn't just a lamp, it's a cosmic reset button. I'm starting to think my SPF 50 is a bit optimistic for a micronova. When that solar shell hits, it doesn't just give us a bad sunburn. It interacts with the Earth's own weakening magnetic field. According to the engineering math found in the redacted files, this interaction causes a phase transition in the Earth's mantle. The rock layers beneath our feet, usually solid enough to hold continents in place, suddenly behave like a liquid. The lock breaks, and as the Earth continues to rotate, the crust, the loose orange skin we talked about, slips. This is the 12,000-year cycle. It's a defrag of the biological hard drive. And if you do the math from the end of the last sneezy at the younger driest boundary, you realize a very uncomfortable truth. We are currently at year 11600. We're living on the last few centuries of a 12,000-year lease, and I haven't even finished my to-watch list. Is it happening again? The archive says the signs are there. We are currently witnessing a rapid weakening of the Earth's magnetic field, down 15% since the 1800s. We are watching the North Pole drift toward Siberia at a speed that has quadrupled in just a few decades. The official story tells us these are just curiosities of geophysics. But the 12,000-year theory tells us these are the warning lights on the dashboard before the system goes offline. The ancients seem to know the schedule. They didn't build their monuments to show off. They built them to endure the transition. They looked at the stars, not as wonder, but as a calendar. And as the magnetic field drops and the sun begins its pre-nova flicker, we have to wonder, are we the first generation to understand the clock, or just the next one to be erased by it? Mainstream geology treats the Earth like a solid, immutable ball of rock. They call it true polar wander, and they assure us that if the poles ever decide to move, they'll do it at a snail's pace, a few inches every 1,000 years. It's a comfortable theory because it implies we have all the time in the world to adapt. But Chan Thomas looked at the gap, that 200,000 years of silence in our record, and realized that the official story might be missing a fundamental law of physics. To understand the forbidden physics, you have to stop thinking like a geologist and start thinking like an engineer. You have to look at the Earth not as a rock, but as a machine. In the 1950s, Charles Hapgood, with the explicit support of Albert Einstein, proposed a radical idea: cataclysmic crustal displacement. Hapgood argued that the Earth's crust isn't actually bolted to the mantle. It's a thin shell, about 30 miles thick, floating on a semi-liquid layer of molten rock. Under normal conditions, the Earth's rotation and its magnetic field act as a stabilizer, keeping that shell locked in place by sheer electromagnetic force. But Hapgood and Einstein realized something terrifying. If the weight of the ice caps at the poles grows too heavy, or if the magnetic lock fails, the entire shell can slip. So, academia says the Earth is a slow-moving river, but Einstein is over here saying it's a Formula One car hitting a patch of ice at 1,000 miles per hour. I know which one sounds like a better movie, but I'm not sure I like the ending. This is where Chan Thomas comes in. As a project engineer, Thomas understood gyroscopic torque. Think of a spinning top. As long as it's spinning fast and balanced, it stays upright. But if you tap it, or if the internal weight shifts, it doesn't just wobble, it flips. Thomas's theory was that our planet is a giant biological gyroscope. He argued that the trigger isn't just the weight of the ice, but the sun. Every 12,000 years, during the solar micronova we discussed, the incoming plasma disrupts the Earth's magnetic field so violently that the lubricant layer in the mantle undergoes a phase transition. For a few hours, the friction holding the crust in place drops to zero, and as the Earth continues to rotate at 1,000 miles per hour at the equator, the crust, it slips. The land moves thousands of miles. The North Pole isn't in the Arctic anymore, it's in central Siberia. And because the oceans and the atmosphere are not attached to the crust, they don't move with it. They keep their original momentum. This is the origin of the 2-mile high tide. It's not a wave caused by an earthquake. It's the entire ocean continuing to move forward while the land beneath it slides away. Einstein himself wrote to Hapgood, admitting that this was the only theory that mathematically accounted for the flash freeze and the sudden extinction of the mammoths. He knew the physics worked. But Einstein's endorsement and Thomas's engineering reports were buried under the same black ink that sanitizes the archive. Why? Because if you accept the physics of a loose-skinned Earth, you have to accept that our civilization is built on a foundation that can, and will, reset. It turns our history from a progress report into a countdown. The architects gave us a planet with a drift setting and then hid the manual, probably because they knew we'd never get any work done if we knew the floor was a treadmill. The silence of the redacted files is the loudest evidence we have. It tells us that the physics are known, the cycle is understood, and the result is documented in the scars of the past. We aren't just fighting climate change. We are living through the pre-nova flicker of a system that is preparing to defrag. We've talked about the redacted files and the gyroscopic math. We've looked at the frozen mammoths and the drowned sphinx. But to truly understand the beauty and the terror of this theory, you have to imagine the moment the music stops. In the official story, the world ends with a whimper. A slow, multi-generational shift in climate that gives civilization centuries to retreat. But in the world of Chan Thomas and Charles Hapgood, the world ends with a snap. Imagine a Tuesday. People are commuting, trading stocks, and arguing over politics. The parenthesis of peace feels as solid as granite. But then the magnetic lock, that invisible force holding the crust in place, finally reaches the breaking point. The phase transition occurs in the mantle. The friction drops to zero, and the ground beneath your feet, which has been moving at a steady, reliable pace for 12,000 years, suddenly lurches. It's not just a bad day at the office. It's the office, the building, and the entire zip code moving toward the horizon at several hundred miles per hour. I hope you didn't leave the oven on. According to the theory, as the crust slips, the inertia of the atmosphere and the oceans takes over. If you've ever tried to run through a swimming pool, you know that water has a mind of its own. Now, imagine that on a global scale. As the land slides south, the Pacific Ocean stays where it is. To an observer on the ground, it wouldn't look like the land is moving. It would look like the horizon is rising. A 2-mile-high wall of water, thick with the debris of entire forests and cities, rushing across the continents. This is the supersonic erasure. It's not just a flood. It's a physical scrubbing of the Earth's surface. But the water is only half the story. As the crust shifts, the atmosphere is whipped into a frenzy. We're talking about supersonic winds, currents of air moving so fast they generate heat, followed immediately by the flash freeze we saw in Siberia. As the poles shift to the equator and the equator moves to the poles, the climate doesn't change, it's replaced. So, you get hit by a skyscraper-sized wave, and if you somehow survive that, you're immediately turned into a human popsicle by a 1,000-mile-per-hour wind. It's starting to sound like the architects didn't design this place for long-term residency. This leads us to the most unsettling part of the archive, the genetic bottleneck. Mainstream genetics tells us that around 12,000 to 70,000 years ago, the human population didn't just decline, it collapsed. We went from millions of individuals to just a few thousand, a tiny group of survivors huddled in the high places of the world. In the theory of the sneeze, this wasn't an evolutionary fluke. It was the result of a system-wide erasure. Version 1.0 of our civilization didn't fail. It was simply removed to make room for the update. The survivors weren't the strongest or the smartest. They were the ones who happened to be standing on the few patches of Earth that didn't drown or freeze. They were the ones who became the Adam and Eve of the next cycle, starting over with nothing but stories and a lingering ancestral fear of the sky. It wasn't a transition, it was a shutdown. And as the black mat settled over the ruins of the world that came before us, the silence was absolute. But as we'll see in our final chapter, that silence is beginning to break. Because the 12,000-year timer doesn't care if we've forgotten the music. The pendulum is already on its way back. We like to think of ourselves as the masters of this world. We look at our cities, our satellites, and our silicon, and we tell ourselves that we are the pinnacle of a long, unbroken climb. But the archive suggests a more humbling reality. We aren't the authors of this story. We're just the characters in the latest chapter. And the ink on our page is starting to dry. If the 12,000-year cycle is real, then we are the beneficiaries of the last sneeze. We are the descendants of the few who stood on the high ground while the world was scrubbed clean. But Chan Thomas and other researchers in the forbidden space noticed something even more peculiar than the physical erasure of our cities. They noticed a patch in our own biology. Mainstream genetics often struggles to explain the Big Bang of the mind, that moment 50,000 years ago when humans suddenly went from simple stone tools to complex art, language, and culture. Some theorists suggest this wasn't evolution. It was an update. They point to the TKTL1 patch, a specific genetic mutation that allows our brains to grow more neurons than our Neanderthal cousins. It's a biological upgrade that seems to have appeared out of nowhere. So we didn't just get smart. We got a firmware update that Neanderthals couldn't download because their hardware was too old. Convenient, but why give a worker race such a powerful brain? Some, like Dr. Ellis Silver, suggest the master code wasn't designed for our comfort. He points to our biological misfits. The fact that the sun burns us, the Earth's gravity gives us back pain, and we are the only species on the planet that suffers from chronic anxiety about a future we can't control. Silver's beautiful, haunting theory is that we aren't actually from here. We are a guest account on a planet that resets every 12,000 years. And the reason we have savants, people who can calculate pi to the 1,000th decimal or play a symphony after hearing it once, isn't because they are superhuman. It's because they have a leak in the slave code. In a savant, the throttle on the brain fails. For a brief moment, we see what the human mind is actually capable of when the architects aren't holding the leash. We see the raw processing power of the original code before it was patched to keep us focused on the day-to-day survival of the gold mine. So my inability to do long division isn't a lack of talent. It's just the factory settings working exactly as intended. I feel much better now. But if the lease is 12,000 years, where does that leave us? We look at the dashboard of the planet and we see the warning lights. The magnetic field is weakening. The South Atlantic anomaly is growing. The North Pole is racing towards Siberia at a speed that has left navigators baffled. These are the same pre-nova flickers described in the redacted pages of Chan Thomas's engineering reports. We see the elite building seed vaults in the Svalbard ice and private bunkers in the New Zealand mountains. They aren't preparing for a bad decade. They are preparing for the defrag. So, is it real? Is the 12,000-year sneeze a biological and geological certainty? Or is it just the ultimate ghost story for a civilization that has grown too arrogant? Mainstream science will tell you there is nothing to fear, that the poles move slowly and the sun is a stable friend. But the archive tells us that the mammoths were eating buttocks when the lights went out. It tells us the Sphinx was drowned by a rain that didn't belong in the desert. And it tells us that Chan Thomas's math was scary enough for the CIA to hide it for half a century. The code is written. The archive tells us what happened. But we don't deal in absolute truths here. We just open the files and look at the patterns. Are we the masters of our destiny, or are we just waiting for the system to reboot? The evidence is on the table. The verdict is yours.